By the last full year of the war, it took the German air defenses around 16,000 shells to bring down one Allied bomber. 16,000. That is not a figure of speech. Early in the war, it had cost a few thousand rounds to kill a heavy bomber. By 1944, the same kill cost 16,000, because the bombers flew higher and tighter and in numbers that no wall of gunfire could really stop. So, Germany built the wall anyway. Thousands of guns. Close to 1 million people tied to the ground around them, feeding the barrels, running the rangefinders, watching the sky. And the bombers came through it. Every day and every night. By the hundreds and then by the thousands. And the cities burned all the same. And by then, the Germans had already built the thing that broke that arithmetic. Not a bigger gun. Not more of them. A single rocket that did not spray the sky and pray. It rose on its own power, straight up to the exact height where the bombers flew, and it killed with one shot. It was the first guided anti-aircraft missile in the history of the world. They named it Wasserfall, waterfall. It flew. It worked in test after test over the Baltic. And it never fired a shot at an enemy, because Germany's own leadership killed the project before it could. So there are two questions here, and the second is darker than the first. The first is simple. What was this weapon, and could it really have done what its builders swore it could? The second is the one that haunts the whole story. Why would a country being burned alive from the air build the one thing that might put the fire out, and then decide to let it die? The answer to that runs through a tunnel inside a mountain, and it is not really about a rocket at all. Start where the weight of it actually fell. Not on a map in a headquarters, but inside an aluminum tube full of men 5 miles up over Germany on the bomb run. For an American or British bomber crew, the worst part was not the fighters. Fighters you could shoot at. Fighters were a fight. The flak was something else. You flew toward the target in tight formation, straight and level, because the bomb site needed straight and level. And ahead of you the sky simply turned black. Not clouds. Thousands of separate puffs of exploding steel. Each one a shell that had been aimed not at where you were, but at where the gunners had calculated you would be. You could not climb out of it. You could not dodge. You held your heading and flew into the black and listened to the fragments rattle against the skin of the airplane like gravel thrown against a tin roof. And you watched the airplane beside you take a burst in the wing and fall out of the sky, and you kept flying straight because that was the job. Men described it the same way for the rest of their lives. You could not fight it. You could only ride through it and hope the next one did not have your name on it. That black sky was the best air defense Germany had. And it was losing. The problem was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was merciless. Heavy flak was never a precision weapon. It was a statistical one. You filled a box of sky with bursting shells, and you hoped a bomber flew through the wrong piece of it at the wrong instant. Against a few aircraft that was expensive. Against 1,000 aircraft, packed into formations and crossing fast and high, it took a mountain of steel to get a handful of kills. 16,000 shells for one bomber on average by the last year. Every one of those shells had to be made in a factory and hauled to a gun and fired by a trained crew. And there were thousands of those guns ringing every city and every refinery, and behind them close to 1 million people who were therefore not doing anything else for the war. Contemporaries had a bitter name for the whole apparatus. They called it the shell eater. The other half of the defense, the fighter planes, was in even worse trouble. They had once torn into the bombers and made daylight raids look suicidal. Then, late in 1943, the long-range escort arrived. American fighters that could now fly all the way to the target and back, and their job was not to protect the bombers so much as to hunt the German fighters out of the sky and kill them. The defenders started dying faster than they could be trained. Fuel ran short. The sky stopped belonging to Germany. So put the two sides next to each other. Both faced the same problem. How do you survive the bomber? The two answers could not have been more different. And the difference was not cleverness. It was arithmetic running in opposite directions. The Allies were winning the production war, and they knew it. So their answer to the bomber problem was, in the end, brutally simple. Build more bombers than the enemy can shoot down. Escort them with more fighters than the enemy can field. Accept the losses, terrible as they were, because the factories at home could always make good the gap and keep coming. Their solution was mass. They did not need a miracle. They needed to not stop. Germany could not play that game, and the leadership knew it. They could not outbuild the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union all at once. If the answer was going to be more, they had already lost, because there would never be more. So the German answer to the bomber had to be different in kind. Not more steel in the sky, but smarter steel. One weapon so much better than a gun that it changed the equation itself. A single shot that did not miss. They went looking for a silver bullet, because a silver bullet was the only kind of victory the numbers still allowed. And on the 25th of September, 1942, that search became official. Hermann Göring authorized the development of a whole family of guided anti-aircraft weapons at once. Several designs, several teams, racing the same idea from different directions. Most of them would go nowhere. One of them, built by the same men who had built the rocket that bombed London, would go further than any guided missile had ever gone. It would actually fly to the edge of working. It was the strangest of all of them, because its central idea was almost backwards. Everyone else was trying to win the race against the bomber. These men decided not to chase the bomber at all. Think about what an anti-aircraft shell actually does. You point a gun at a piece of sky, you fire, and the shell coasts upward toward a spot where you have guessed the bomber will be in 20 seconds. It cannot change its mind. It cannot follow. By the time it arrives, a bomber 3 or 4 miles up has had all those seconds to simply be somewhere else. You are never shooting at the airplane. You are shooting at a prediction. That is the real reason it took 16,000 of them. Almost every shell was aimed at empty air. So, the men at the German Rocket Center did not try to build a faster shell or a bigger gun or more of them. They asked a different question entirely. What if the thing you fired could keep thinking on the way up? What if it did not coast toward a guess, but flew under control, correcting itself all the way to the target, and was told the exact moment to go off? That is not a shell. That is a guided missile. And in 1942, almost no one on Earth had built one that worked. The Germans would come closer than anyone alive. They solved nearly every piece of it. Nearly. The men who took it on were the obvious choice because they were the only people alive who had already built something close. The work went to the German Army's rocket center on the Baltic coast, at Peenemünde, to the same group, under General Walter Dornberger and the engineer Werner von Braun, that was then finishing the VI-2, the rocket built to fall on London. Hold that picture for later, because it matters more than it seems right now. The same hands that were building the Speer to throw at an enemy city were also building the shield to hold over their own. What they designed was, in plain terms, a smaller V2 turned to a new purpose. It stood about 25 feet tall, roughly a quarter the weight of the rocket that hit London, with 4 fins at the tail and a second set of short, stubby wings around its middle. That odd waste of wings is how you can still tell it apart from every other rocket of the war at a glance. It did not need to be huge because it did not have to cross the English Channel. It only had to climb a few miles straight up. A smaller problem and a far smaller rocket. And the cleverest part was the fuel, and it is the part people skip. The V2 ran on liquid oxygen, which boils away the moment you pour it in. You could never keep a V2 standing ready. You fueled it at the last minute and you launched it, or you drained it and started over. A weapon meant to catch bombers cannot live like that, because the bombers do not send word ahead. So, Wasserfall used a different and far nastier pair of liquids, the kind that can sit in a tank without boiling off, and that burst into flame the instant they touch each other. The point of them was patience. The missile could stand in its launcher, fully fueled, for days or even weeks, and fire within moments of the sirens. That single change from a rocket you prepare to a rocket that simply waits is most of what turns a science experiment into a weapon, and the numbers were right for the job. It was built to climb to around 60,000 feet, well above the bombers, faster than the speed of sound, carrying a warhead of about 300 kilograms of high explosive. That warhead was deliberately large, because the plan was not to thread a missile through a single airplane. The plan was to drive it into the middle of a tight formation, a box of dozens of bombers flying wingtip to wingtip, and detonate and let the blast and a storm of steel tear through several of them at once. One shot fired at a crowd instead of 16,000 shots fired at a prediction. And it was guided. A crew on the ground tracked both the missile and the bombers and steered the missile into the stream by radio as it climbed, riding it into the target by eye. They tested all of this over the Baltic through 1944 from Peenemünde and a small island off the coast, and the remarkable thing is that it largely worked. Not every time. Plenty of them failed. But of the rounds they fired, well over half flew the way they were meant to. The airframe held together past the speed of sound. The engine ran. A brand new kind of weapon built in the middle of a collapsing country was climbing into the sky on command and doing roughly what its designers promised. But flying is not the same as killing. The missile flew. The engine ran, the guidance answered. And the one piece that decided whether any of that could actually bring down a bomber was not the rocket at all. It was a small thing called a proximity fuse, the device that senses an aircraft nearby and tells the warhead the precise instant to explode, since the missile is never going to actually touch the plane it is hunting. The Germans had not finished that fuse. Remember that, because it comes back, and it is the hinge that the entire question of what if swings on. Because on paper, by the end of that year, Germany was holding what looked like the answer to the black sky. A supersonic rocket that waited, fueled and ready, that climbed on command to the bomber's own altitude and killed a whole piece of a formation at a stroke. The obvious next thought is the one the German leadership had too. Build them by the thousand. Ring every city with them. And that is exactly where the story turns, and turns badly. The plan they drew up for Wasserfall was enormous. The idea was to defend Germany the way the flak belts already tried to, but with a weapon that actually worked. Something like 200 batteries to cover every German city of any real size. In the most ambitious version, close to 300. Enough to wall off the whole country under a roof of rockets. And to feed all of that, the planners wanted production on the order of 5,000 missiles every month. Those numbers were a fantasy, and it is only honest to say so. A country that was being pounded flat, that was short of fuel and metal and skilled hands and time, was never going to build 5,000 precision-guided missiles a month on top of the tanks and the fighters and everything else it was failing to build already. But the size of the dream tells you how badly they wanted it, and how big they thought the prize was. A wall of rockets over every city. The black sky finally turned around to face the bombers. And then, in February of 1945, with the weapon closer to working than anything of its kind had ever come, the German leadership cancelled it. On the 6th of February, the SS General, who by then held control over Germany's missile programs, Hans Kammler, ordered Wasserfall wound down. What effort remained would go to a small, cheap, unguided anti-aircraft rocket called Typhoon, a thing you fired in massed barrages and hoped, which was really just the old statistical gamble in a cheaper coat. A week and a half later, the rocket center at Peenemünde was ordered evacuated, and that was effectively the end of it. The first guided anti-aircraft missile in history was switched off a few months before the men who built it might have finished the job. Why? Why would a nation whose cities were burning to the ground turn off the one weapon built to stop it? Part of the answer is just the cold bookkeeping of defeat. By early 1945, there was barely enough of anything left to finish the weapons already on the line, let alone perfect a brand new one that still needed its hardest problem solved. Kammler was choosing the cheap thing that might reach the field in weeks over the brilliant thing that needed another year Germany did not have. On its own terms, in that month, it was almost a rational call. But there is a harder answer underneath that one, and it is the part that has made people angry ever since. Because for years, the same rocket center, the same engineers, the same scarce alloys and fuels had been pouring a staggering effort into the other rocket, the V2, the one built to fall on London. Think about what those two machines actually were side by side, because the whole tragedy is in the contrast. The V2 was a weapon of pure revenge. It could not be aimed at anything smaller than a city. It could not change the course of the war, and its own designers knew it. And every single one was gone the instant it launched. A ton of the finest engineering in the world thrown one way across the channel to kill a handful of people and rattle a few more. Wasserfall was the opposite kind of thing in every respect. It defended. It stood and waited and could fire again the next night and the night after that. One was a spear thrown blind at the enemy city. The other was a shield you could hold over your own. And Germany, handed the choice of where to spend its genius for rockets, had spent years on the spear and then, at the end, killed the shield. The man who ran Germany's whole war economy saw it that way too, and it ate at him for the rest of his life. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, came to call the obsession with the V2 one of the great mistakes of the war. After it was all over, he argued that if Germany had thrown its weight behind Wasserfall and the jet fighters a year earlier and used them to defend its skies instead of avenging them, the Allied bombing of German industry might have been brought to a halt. The capacity had been there all along, he insisted. Germany was still managing to build 900 of the big V2s a month, even as the country fell apart around the factories. The hands and the steel existed. They had simply been spent, year after year, on the wrong rocket. It is a haunting claim, and it is exactly the question this whole story has been circling toward. Was he right? If the shield had been built instead of the spear, if there really had been 300 batteries of supersonic missiles waiting over the cities when the bombers came, could they actually have stopped the bombing? Or is that just the bitterness of a beaten man, explaining 30 years later why the war he helped run was lost? It deserves a real answer. And the honest answer has two sides, and the truth sits in the hard ground between them. Start with the case that it could have mattered, because it is stronger than people expect. By the summer of 1944, something had shifted in the sky over Germany. The German fighters, hunted down by the American escorts, were nearly finished as a fighting force. And that left the flak, the dumb, statistical 16,000 rounds per kill flak. And here is the part everyone forgets. Even that crude weapon by that summer was doing most of the killing. An 8th Air Force analysis that autumn found that over those months the guns were bringing down close to 2/3 of every heavy bomber the force lost, and touching almost everyone that came home damaged. Not the fighters, the flak. The least efficient air defense in the world was still, by sheer weight of falling steel, the main thing killing American bombers. So do the thought experiment the German planners were doing. Take the flak, the thing already causing most of your losses, while it threw away 15,900 shells out of every 16,000, and swap it for a weapon that does not throw them away. A weapon that climbs to the bomber and kills with one shot. You do not need many before the arithmetic that the bomber crews lived by comes apart. Because the Allies were not bottomless, and there was a number. Never written on any order, but real. A loss rate past which daylight bombing simply could not go on. They had already touched it once. On the worst of the Schweinfurt raids, around 1 bomber in 5 did not come home, and the deep raids into Germany were quietly suspended until the long-range escorts arrived to make them survivable. A crew flew its tour knowing the odds, and at a few percent lost per mission, the math of surviving a whole tour was already brutal. Push that routine rate up by several more points, raid after raid after raid, and the campaign does not bend. It breaks. That is the real case for Wasserfall. It never had to down every bomber. It only had to make the price unpayable, and the clumsy flak was already most of the way there with a club. That is the dream. Here is the cold water, and it is just as well documented, and it is where most serious historians come down. First, the timing is fatal to the whole fantasy. The weapon that was supposed to change 1944 had its first clean flight only that February, and it was still failing one launch in 3 when it was cancelled a year later, with the war all but lost. The hour when it could have mattered had already passed before it worked. Second, and this is the piece worth remembering from earlier, the missile could not actually kill a bomber yet, because the proximity fuse was never finished. That little device was the whole game. Without it, a supersonic rocket flashing past a formation has to be set off by a man on the ground guessing the exact right instant by eye. Or it has to physically strike an aircraft, which at those closing speeds is very nearly impossible. A missile that flies flawlessly to the target and detonates half a second wrong is a very expensive miss. The single part that turned Wasserfall from a flying firework into a bomber killer was the part that did not exist. Third, the guidance. One man steering one missile into one target by eye in daylight and clear weather. Against a river of 1,000 bombers, a weapon that can engage a single aircraft at a time is not a wall over a city. It is one sniper against an army. Fourth, the enemy would not have sat still. The Allies were already jamming German radio and blinding German radar with clouds of foil. A missile flown by a radio command link and tracked from the ground was a natural target for exactly that. And the launch sites were fixed, and the strange hypergolic fuel came from chemical plants that could be found and flattened. The same bombers Wasserfall was meant to stop would have made its launch pads and its acid factories priority targets the week they appeared. So who is right? Speer, or the historians who answer him? The honest verdict, the one that respects the evidence, is that both are partly right. And the headline version, the weapon that could have stopped the bombing, is too strong to stand. In the most generous reading, a working Wasserfall, fielded in numbers in time, might have shoved the loss rate on the deepest raids back toward that 1 in 5 line, forced the bombers higher or onto worse routes or back into the dark, and bought the dying country a little time. It would not have stopped the bombing, and it could not have been finished in time to try. What Wasserfall really was is the first example of a kind of weapon that did not exist yet, glimpsed a few years too early by the one country that needed it most and could least afford to complete it. And there is one more thing that has to be said about that shield over the German cities, the part the clean engineering story always leaves out. The question of who, exactly, was going to build 5,000 of these a month. The answer is the darkest turn in the whole story. The clean version of this story is about engineers and physics, a brilliant idea strangled by bad decisions. The real version has a second half the engineering never mentions, and it begins with a plain question. By the last years of the war, who actually built German rockets? The answer is prisoners, slaves, worked to death. By the time Wasserfall was being readied for production, the German rocket program had already settled how its rockets would be made, and the answer was concentration camp labor. Prisoners were brought to Peenemünde itself from the middle of 1943. And after the British bombed Peenemünde that August, the whole business of building rockets was moved underground, into a vast network of tunnels dug into a mountain in central Germany, a complex called the Mittelwerk, run by the SS and fed by a concentration camp created for the sole purpose of supplying it with bodies. The camp was called Mittelbau-Dora. Around 60,000 prisoners passed through Dora and the camps around it. Roughly 20,000 of them died. They died of starvation and exhaustion and disease, of beatings, of hangings staged as warnings. They dug the tunnels, and then they were made to live inside them, in the wet rock and the dark and the dust, assembling the most advanced machines of the war for the men who were working them to death. And here is the fact that should stop anyone who tells this as a tale of clever engineering. More people were killed building the V2 than were ever killed by it. The rocket took something over 5,000 lives when it fell on London and Antwerp. It took at least twice that many in the tunnels where it was made. It is very likely the only weapon in history that killed more of the people forced to build it than of the enemy it was aimed at. For decades after the war, the men who ran the program told a clean story about themselves. Apolitical engineers, dreamers of spaceflight, who simply happened to work under a regime they were powerless to refuse. The surviving documents tell a harder story. In 1943, the project's leadership met and recommended moving production underground, using camp labor. Memos in the engineers' own hands called for prisoners. And in the summer of 1944, Wernher von Braun, the technical genius at the very center of it, went in person to the Buchenwald concentration camp to help select prisoners for the rocket works. This is not a man swept helplessly along by history. This is a man helping to organize the use of slaves. Now set that against the shield. Wasserfall, the weapon meant to save German cities from the bombs, was a project of that same center, those same men, that same system. Every plan to build it by the thousand ran directly through the SS tunnels and the dying men inside them. The 5,000 missiles a month that Speer dreamed of would have been assembled by prisoners in the dark under the guns of their guards. The shield meant to protect German civilians would have been forged by slaves worked to death to forge it. There is no clean version of this. The same machine that might have saved one group of people was already grinding another group into the rock. The engineers have names, and most of them went on to long and comfortable lives. The men who actually built the rockets are, almost every one of them, nameless to us now. They are a number, 20,000, in the ledger of a camp. That is the part of the story that never appears on the cutaway diagram of the missile. Because the engineers did go on to long and comfortable lives, that is how this ends, and it ends a long way from a tunnel in Germany. When the war stopped, the most valuable thing left in the wreckage of the German rocket effort was not the hardware. It was the handful of people who understood it, and the victors came for them. Wernher von Braun and the core of his team were brought to the United States. The Soviets took their share of the men and the machines from what was left. Among the designs the Americans carried home was Wasserfall itself, which they rebuilt almost part for part as a missile called Hermes, not to field it, but to learn from it. It was a teacher, and what it taught, over the next 15 years, grew into the thing Germany had only glimpsed, the real surface-to-air missile. In America, that work led to Nike. In the Soviet Union, it led to the systems the West would learn to fear. And then the weapon Germany invented to kill the bomber went and did exactly that for everyone else. For, on the 1st of May, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile, a direct descendant of the idea first flown on that Baltic test range, reached up past 70,000 feet and knocked an American spy plane out of a sky its pilot had believed was far too high to touch. The age of the untouchable bomber, the age that had burned Germany's cities one after another while the flak fired and missed, was finished. And the thing that finished it was the thing Germany had built first and killed first, 15 years too early to save a single street of its own. Go back to where this started. The black sky over Germany. The 16,000 shells it took to bring down one bomber. The cities burning underneath it all the same. The answer to that sky existed. It was standing on a test stand on the Baltic coast, fueled and flying and most of the way to real. And the country that needed it more than anyone alive chose the Speer over the shield, built the little it built with slaves, and switched off the rest a few months before the end. It did not save them. It went on after them to remake the whole idea of who owns the sky. Almost none of this is in the usual histories. The weapon that became the future of air defense sat secret for years. and the people inside the story are split now into the famous and the forgotten. The famous ones went to the moon. The forgotten ones are a number in a camp ledger, and the bomber crews who flew straight and level into the black are names cut into stones in England. We pulled this out of declassified files and old technical reports. The records almost nobody opens because it seemed worth telling straight. If it was worth your time, leave a word and say so the people in it, the ones who were handed a future and the ones who were not, do not slip all the way back into the quiet. That, in the end, is the only reason to dig these things back up, so that they are not simply gone.